In the far corner of a dusty, old community center, there sat a piano that had seen better days. It was an upright model, covered in a thick layer of gray grime, with keys that had yellowed like old teeth. Most people walked right past it without a second glance. To them, it was just another piece of furniture taking up space, like the broken chairs or the folding tables stacked against the wall. But to the boy, it was everything. The boy was 12 years old. Though he looked smaller because of his thin frame and the way he hunched his shoulders, always trying to make himself take up less space in the world. His name was Elian. He lived in a part of the city where the buildings were crowded together and the noise never stopped. Sirens, shouting, and the constant rumble of trains were the soundtrack of his life. But inside the community center, it was quiet. Elian didn't go there to play basketball or to hang out with the other kids. He didn't have many friends, and the ones he did have didn't really understand him. They thought he was strange because he rarely spoke. At school, the teachers often forgot he was there. He would sit in the back row, staring out the window, his mind far away from the math problems on the chalkboard. If a teacher asked him a question, he would usually just nod or shrug. They had started to label him as slow or difficult, simply because he didn't have the words to explain what was going on inside his head every day after school. While the other kids ran to the park or the arcade, Elian would walk quietly to the community center. He would wave to the old lady at the front desk, Mrs. Gable, a kind woman with tired eyes who always wore a sweater, even in the summer, and then he would disappear into the back room. The room smelled like old floor wax and damp wood. Elian would pull out the bench and sit down. He wouldn't play a single note. Not yet. He would just rest his hands on the keys, feeling the cool plastic against his fingertips. He would close his eyes and listen. He listened to the silence until it wasn't silent anymore. To Elian, the world was made of music. It wasn't just sound. It was color and emotion. When he heard the rain hitting the leaky window pane, he heard a gentle, rhythmic pattering on the high keys. When the old heater in the corner kicked on with a groan and a rattle, he heard a deep, booming bass line. He would sit there for hours, his fingers hovering over the keys, tracing the shapes of the songs he heard in his head. He was teaching himself, though no one knew it. He couldn't read a single note of sheet music. The black dots and lines on a page looked like confusing little ants to him. But he didn't need the paper. The music was already inside him, waiting to get out. He was scared to let it out, though. He felt that if he played, the magic might disappear, or worse, people would laugh at him. One rainy Tuesday, Mrs. Gable came into the back room to empty the trash bins. She watched Elian for a moment. He was sitting motionless, head bowed, hands poised. "Elian, honey?" she asked softly. Elian jumped, pulling his hands back into his lap as if he had been burned. He looked up at her with wide, dark eyes. "You've been coming here for months," Mrs. Gable said, leaning on her broom. "Don't you want to learn how to play? We could maybe find someone to teach you. Or you could just bang on it a little. It's good for the soul to make some noise." Elian looked down at his shoes. They were old sneakers with the soles peeling off. He wanted to tell her that he was playing just in his mind. He wanted to tell her that the songs were so beautiful they made his chest hurt. But the words were stuck in his throat. He just shook his head. "No-do," Mrs. Gable sighed, a sound full of pity. "Okay, sweetie. You just sit there. It's safe in here." She walked away, shaking her head slightly. To her, and to everyone else, Elian was just a lonely, quiet boy wasting his afternoon. They didn't see the genius hiding in the silence. They saw a kid who had nothing better to do. They saw someone who would probably grow up to work a low-paying job and disappear into the background, just like he was doing now. This was the hardest part for Elian, the feeling of being invisible. He knew what people thought of him. He saw the way the other kids looked at him when he walked by, their whispers trailing behind him. They called him the mute. They laughed at his ragged clothes. One afternoon, a few weeks before the big community talent show, a group of older boys came into the room. They were loud, knocking things over and laughing. They were looking for a place to hide from the rain. When they saw Elian sitting at the piano, they stopped. Look who it is, one of them said, leaning against the doorframe. He was tall and wore a jacket that looked too expensive for this neighborhood. The statue. Another boy laughed. Hey, statue, move, we want to put our stuff on that bench. Elian didn't move. He gripped the edges of the bench, his knuckles turning white. He was terrified. I said move, the first boy said, stepping closer. He reached out to shove Elian's shoulder. Suddenly, without thinking, Elian slapped his hand down on the piano keys. It wasn't a song. It was just a loud, discordant crash of notes. Asterisk bang. The noise echoed through the room, shocking everyone into silence. The boys took a step back, surprised by the sudden noise. Elian sat there, breathing hard, his heart pounding like a drum. He hadn't meant to do it. It was just a reflex, a way to say I'm here without speaking. For a second, the leader of the boys looked angry. But then he started laughing. Oh, wow. He can make noise. I thought you were broken or something. They all laughed. It wasn't a nice laugh. It was the laugh of people who enjoy tearing others down. They grabbed their bags and pushed past the piano, mocking Elian as they left. Good job, Mozart, one sneered as the door swung shut. Elian sat alone in the silence again. The bad chord he had hit was still fading away, ringing in his ears. He felt a hot flush of shame on his cheeks. He put his head down on the cool wood of the piano and let a few tears fall. They doubted him. Everyone doubted him. They thought he was nothing. They thought he was weird. But as he sat there, crying quietly, his hand found the keys again. He pressed one soft, gentle note. It rang out pure and clear like a bell in the distance. Then another. And then, slowly, a melody began to form in his mind, sad but strong. It was the sound of his own heart. He wasn't playing for them. He was playing for himself. He stayed there until the sun went down and the streetlights flickered on outside. The shadows in the room grew long, stretching out like fingers toward him. Elian knew he couldn't stay silent forever. The music inside him was getting too loud to ignore. He didn't know how and he didn't know when, but he knew that soon, very soon, the piano would have to speak for him. The community center walls, usually a dull and fading gray, were now covered in bright neon posters. It was that time of year again, the time when the entire neighborhood came together for the annual community showcase. For most people, it was just a fun night to watch kids dance offbeat or attempt magic tricks that went wrong. But for Mrs. Gable, the center's director, it was a source of constant stress. She walked through the hallways holding a clipboard so tightly her knuckles were white. She was chewing on the end of a pen, her eyes scanning the room desperately. I need 2 more acts, she muttered to herself. The show is in 3 days and the second half is empty. She looked around the busy room. There were kids everywhere. Some were painting sets, others were practicing dance moves in the corner. But she knew most of them were too shy or too busy to fill the gap. Her eyes landed on the heavy door of the back room. The quiet room. She knew who was in there. Mrs. Gable walked down the hallway and pushed the door open. Inside, the air was cool and smelled of old wood and dust. Sitting at the old upright piano was Elian. He was in his usual spot, his back straight, his hands resting lightly on the closed keyboard lid. He was perfectly still, like a statue in a museum. Mrs. Gable's heart softened a little. She felt sorry for the boy. He was always so alone, so withdrawn. She watched him for a moment, wondering what went on inside his head. She assumed he was just daydreaming, escaping from a world that didn't understand him. Elian? She said softly. The boy didn't jump. He slowly turned his head, his dark eyes locking onto hers. He didn't speak, just waited. I have a favor to ask, Mrs. Gable said, stepping fully into the room and closing the door behind her. We are really short on acts for the talent show on Friday. I saw you in here the other day. You seem to really love this piano. Elian looked down at the instrument. He ran his fingers along the wood. Love wasn't a strong enough word for what he felt. It was a lifeline. I was thinking, Mrs. Gable continued, her voice kind but dripping with pity, maybe you could play something? It doesn't have to be complicated. Even just chopsticks or Mary Had a Little Lamb, it would be cute. The audience would love to see you up there. Cute, the word hung in the air. Elian felt a small pinch in his chest. She didn't see a musician. She saw a novelty act. She saw a quiet, poor boy who needed a helping hand. He looked back at her, his face blank. He didn't nod. He didn't shake his head. He just looked at his shoes. Suddenly, the door swung open with a bang, hitting the wall with a loud thud. Elian flinched. Standing in the doorway was the tall boy, the same one who had made fun of him weeks ago. He was wearing a flashy jacket and expensive sneakers. He was flanked by two friends, and they were all laughing loudly at something on a phone screen. The tall boy looked up and saw Mrs. Gable. Then he saw Elian. A sneer spread across his face. "Oh. Wow," the tall boy said, walking into the room with his chest puffed out. "Is this the planning meeting for the naptime section?" Mrs. Gable frowned. "Be respectful. We are talking about the talent show." "Him?" The tall boy pointed a finger at Elian, laughing. "For the talent show? Don't make me laugh. I've been coming here for 2 years, and I've never seen his hands move. He treats that piano like a dining table. He just sits there." He walked closer to the piano, leaning down so his face was close to Elian's. "Hey, statue. You planning on staring at the keys for 5 minutes? Because that's not entertainment." Elian gripped the edges of the bench until his fingers hurt. He could feel the heat rising up his neck. He wanted to disappear. He wanted to push the tall boy away and run out of the room. But he stayed frozen. "Stop it," Mrs. Gable said, though her voice wasn't very strong. She was tired, and she knew how these boys were. Everyone has to start somewhere. The tall boy shook his head. "Mrs. Gable, save the show. If you want music, I can play. I'm already doing a classical piece. It's actual music, not whatever he is doing." He reached over and tapped the top of the piano hard. Bang, 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 the noise echoed harshly in the small room. "Hello? Anybody home in there?" The two other boys snickered. Elian looked at the tall boy's hand. He looked at the keys beneath the lid. In his head he heard a sound, not the banging sound the boy had made, but a roar. A deep, angry storm of chords that would drown out the laughter. He imagined the look on the tall boy's face if the piano suddenly screamed. Mrs. Gable sighed, putting a hand on the tall boy's shoulder to push him back gently. "Go on, get out of here." "Let him be." "Whatever," the tall boy said, rolling his eyes. "Don't say I didn't warn you. It's going to be the most boring 5 minutes of the show." He turned and walked out, his friends following him. The door clicking shut behind them, the room was quiet again. Mrs. Gable looked at Elian. "I'm sorry, Elian, they don't understand." "But about the show? If you don't want to, it's okay. But if you do, just let me know. It would mean a lot to me." She looked at her watch. "I have to go check the sound system. Think about it, okay?" She left him alone. Elian sat there in the silence. The dust motes danced in the beam of light coming from the window. He felt small. He felt weak. He felt like everyone's prediction was true, that he was nothing, just a background character in other people's lives. But then, a strange feeling started to grow in his stomach. It started as a tiny spark of anger and grew into a burning fire. He was tired of being pitied. He was tired of being mocked. He was tired of the tall boy acting like he owned the music. Music didn't belong to people who took lessons and bought fancy jackets. Music belonged to the heart. It belonged to the silence. Elian slowly stood up. His legs felt shaky, like they were made of jelly. He walked out of the back room and down the hallway toward the main lobby. Mrs. Gable was at the front desk, rummaging through a drawer. She didn't hear him walk up. He stood there for a moment, watching her. He took a deep breath. This was it. If he did this, there was no going back. He would be walking into the lion's den. He would be standing on a stage under bright lights with everyone watching him, waiting for him to fail. Elian reached out and tapped the desk gently. Mrs. Gable looked up, surprised. "Oh, Elian, did you forget your coat?" Elian shook his head. He reached for the sign-up sheet lying on the counter. It was full of messy handwriting names of people who could sing, people who could dance, people who were loud. He picked up the pen Mrs. Gable had been chewing on. He hesitated for just a split second. His hand trembled, then he pressed the pen to the paper. He wrote slowly, carefully. Under performance type. He wrote one word, piano. He put the pen down and looked at Mrs. Gable. Her eyes went wide. She looked at the name, then at him. "Oh," she breathed out. "Elian, are you sure? You don't have to do this to impress them." Elian didn't smile. He didn't frown. He just nodded once. A firm, solid nod. Mrs. Gable bit her lip. She looked nervous, but she checked the box next to his name. "Okay," she whispered. "Okay, you're on. You're going to be the second to last act. Just have fun, okay?" Elian turned and walked away. As he walked back toward the room, he passed the tall boy and his friends in the hallway. They were sitting on the floor, drinking sodas. Elian kept his head down, trying to be invisible. "Hey, look," one of the friends whispered loudly. "It's the piano master." The tall boy laughed. "Did you sign up, little man? Don't worry. I'll go on right after you. I'll clean up the mess you leave on stage." Elian kept walking. He didn't speed up. He didn't slow down. But inside his pocket, his fist was clenched, so tight his fingernails dug into his palm. They thought it was a joke. They thought he was a joke. He walked back into the music room and closed the door. The silence greeted him like an old friend. He sat down on the bench and looked at the keys. They were yellowed and chipped, but to him, they were beautiful. He lifted the lid. He didn't play yet. He just rested his fingers on the white keys. He closed his eyes and began to hear it. He began to hear the song he was going to play. It wasn't Chopsticks. It wasn't Mary Had a Little Lamb. It was a storm. It was a cry. It was a voice that had been held back for 12 years. The boy who everyone doubted had just made a deal with himself. He wasn't going to the talent show to play cute songs. He was going there to speak. And once the piano started talking, he knew it would be very hard for anyone to make it stop. The night of the big community showcase finally arrived. The air outside the hall was thick and humid, but inside the atmosphere was electric. The old auditorium was packed to capacity. Folding chairs that were usually stacked in the corner were set up in the aisles to accommodate the overflow of parents, grandparents, and neighbors. The smell of popcorn mixed with the dusty scent of the velvet curtains, and the buzz of conversation filled the room like a swarm of bees. Backstage, it was a different kind of chaos. Kids in sparkly costumes were running around, mothers were pinning back hair, and musicians were tuning instruments. Elian stood in the shadows, far away from the noise. He was wearing his best shirt, a plain, white button-down that was a little too stiff and a little too big for him. He felt like he was wearing a costume. Pretending to be a confident performer. Mrs. Gable was rushing past, carrying a stack of papers. She stopped when she saw him, her face softening. "You're up soon, Elian," she whispered, touching his arm gently. "Just remember what I said. Have fun. If you get scared, just look at the piano, not the people." Elian nodded, but he couldn't find his voice to answer. His stomach felt like it was tied in 100 tight knots. He peeked through the heavy velvet curtains at the crowd. The stage lights were already on, turning the front rows into a blinding white fog. Beyond the lights, he could see rows and rows of faces. It looked like an ocean of judgment. Up on stage, a girl just finished singing a popular pop song. She hit a high note that wobbled a bit, and the audience clapped politely. There was a pause as the stage crew moved her microphone stand away. Then Mrs. Gable walked out to the center of the stage. She tapped the microphone to make sure it was working, causing a loud screech that made everyone in the hall cover their ears. "Thank you, everyone, for that lovely performance," Mrs. Gable said, her voice echoing slightly. "For our next act, we have something very special. A student who has been working very hard in our music room. Please welcome Elian." There was a moment of confused silence in the room. Then came a ripple of polite, scattered applause. It wasn't the loud cheering the other acts got. It was the kind of applause people give when they don't know what to expect. "Who is Elian?" A man whispered loudly from the third row. "Must be a new kid," someone else answered. Elian took a deep breath. He felt like his feet were made of lead, but he forced them to move. He walked out from the safety of the curtains and into the bright lights. The heat hit his face instantly. It was so bright he couldn't see the audience anymore. He could only see the silhouette of the grand piano, sitting in the middle of the stage. It was a much bigger instrument than the old upright he practiced on. It was black and shiny, looking sleek and dangerous. It seemed to stare back at him, challenging him. As he walked across the stage, a figure in the front row caught his eye. It was the tall boy. He was sitting with his arms crossed over his chest, a smirk plastered on his face. Even in the bright lights, Elian could see the look of amusement in his eyes. The tall boy leaned over to the person sitting next to him and whispered something, then laughed. Elian knew he was laughing at him. The doubt crashed over Elian like a cold wave. He's right, the voice in his head said. Asterisk, you don't belong here. You're going to embarrass yourself. Everyone will laugh. Asterisk, he reached the piano bench and sat down. The height felt different. The keys were pristine white, perfect and unmarked. They seemed to dare him to touch them. He adjusted the bench, the metal legs scraping loudly against the wooden floor. The sound echoed through the auditorium, making a few people chuckle nervously. Elian positioned the microphone so it was close to the piano strings. He didn't speak. He didn't look at the audience. He just sat there, his hands resting in his lap. Then he closed his eyes. 5 seconds passed. Then 10. The silence in the room grew heavy. People stopped coughing and shifting in their seats. The quiet became uncomfortable. It stretched on, tight and tense, like a rubber band ready to snap. From the front row, the tall boy shifted his weight. He looked at his watch, then rolled his eyes at Mrs. Gable, who was standing in the wings with her hands clasped together, praying. The audience started to get restless. Is he going to play? Someone whispered. Maybe he forgot the song, a child's voice piped up, followed by a giggle. The doubt in the room was thick enough to choke on. The pressure was immense. Every single person in that hall expected him to fail. They expected him to run off the stage in tears or to play a clumsy, childish tune. They were ready to pity him, but Elian didn't move. He sat still as a statue, his breathing slow and rhythmic. He wasn't frozen in fear. He was focusing. He was clearing his mind of the tall boy's smirk, clearing it of the whispers, clearing it of the expectations. In his mind, he was back in the dusty practice room. He wasn't in a stiff white shirt. He was wearing his old clothes, and the sun was coming through the window. He could hear the rhythm of the rain against the glass. Dum-dum-dock. He could hear the rattle of the train tracks. Chugga-chugga. He brought his hands up from his lap. They hovered over the keys, just inches away. The audience held its collective breath. The tall boy uncrossed his arms, leaning forward slightly. Curious despite himself, Elian's fingers trembled for just a split second, then they became still. He was ready. He wasn't going to play a song for them. He was going to let the piano speak for him. The silence was over. Then it happened. Elian's hands came down. They didn't press the keys gently. They struck them. The sound that exploded from the piano wasn't a single note, but a thunderous, rolling chord that seemed to shake the dust from the rafters. It was so loud, so sudden, that several people in the front row physically jerked back in their seats. The shockwave cut through the whispers instantly. The hall went from a buzz of confusion to a dead, heavy silence in a fraction of a second. Before the echo of that first chord had even faded, Elian's right hand began to move. It started low on the keyboard and raced upward, a cascading waterfall of notes that were fast and sharp. It wasn't the clumsy, stumbling attempt of a beginner. It was precise. It was angry. It was urgent. The music wasn't a classical sonata or a happy pop song. It was raw and untamed. It sounded like the city Elian lived in, chaotic, loud, and sometimes beautiful. The left hand settled into a deep, rhythmic thumping beat, like a heart hammering against a ribcage, while the right hand danced wildly above it. Elian's eyes were still closed, but his face had changed. The look of fear was gone. His jaw was set tight, and his head bobbed slightly to the rhythm he was creating. He wasn't sitting on that bench anymore. He was inside the music. The audience was frozen. For the first 10 seconds, nobody breathed. They stared at the stage, trying to process what they were hearing. This was the quiet boy? This was the kid who sat in the back of the class and never spoke. The contrast was so sharp, so impossible, that it felt like a magic trick. In the front row, the tall boy's smirk evaporated. His mouth opened slightly, hanging agape. He looked from the piano keys to Elian's face, trying to find the trick. He looked at Mrs. Gable in the wings, expecting her to stop it, but she was just standing there, her hands over her mouth, tears already streaming down her cheeks. The music shifted. The frantic racing notes slowed down. The rhythm changed from a pounding beat to a swaying groove that made people want to tap their feet, though they were too stunned to move. It was bluesy and sad, full of a longing that everyone in that room could feel but couldn't name. It sounded like a rainy afternoon with nowhere to go. It sounded like loneliness. Elian's fingers were finding notes he shouldn't have known. He played clusters of notes that clashed together but somehow sounded right, creating a tension that made everyone's muscles tighten. Then he would resolve it with a sweet, high melody that felt like a sudden breath of fresh air. He played with a physical intensity that was surprising. He wasn't just moving his fingers. He was using his whole body. He leaned into the piano, attacking the low notes with his shoulder, then pulling back gently for the soft, high trills. The old grand piano, which had sat silently through so many boring recitals, was finally singing. It seemed to come alive under his hands, vibrating with a power that filled every corner of the hall. People who had been looking at their phones put them down. People who had been whispering to their neighbors stopped talking. The entire room was being pulled into the story Elian was telling. Without saying a single word, he was telling them everything. He was telling them about the nights he sat in the dark. He was telling them about the noise in his head. He was telling them about the things he couldn't say with his mouth. The melody grew louder again. It built up layer by layer, climbing higher and higher, faster and faster. It was like a train gathering speed, rushing toward a destination only Elian could see. The sound was enormous now, filling the space, drowning out the outside world. The tall boy in the front row had completely uncrossed his arms. He was leaning forward, elbows on his knees, captivated. For the first time, he saw Elian not as a target for bullying, but as a force to be reckoned with. He realized that while he had been learning to read notes on a page, Elian had been learning to speak a language that didn't need words. Elian's hands were a blur. They moved so fast they looked like they were flying. The sweat was dripping down his temple, but he didn't wipe it away. He didn't break his concentration. He was in a trance. The music was pouring out of him like water from a broken dam. Releasing years of silence, he hit a series of chords that were so dissonant they made people wince, followed immediately by a melody so beautiful it made them want to weep. It was an emotional roller coaster. The audience was no longer bored. They were on the edge of their seats. They were witnessing something rare, a moment of pure, unfiltered human expression. Near the back of the room, an old man who had spent his whole life playing jazz piano stood up. He couldn't see the stage very well, but he didn't need to. He closed his own eyes and just listened, shaking his head in disbelief. He knew that what the boy was doing was technically difficult, but emotionally it was genius. The boy wasn't playing the piano. The piano was playing the boy. As the song reached its peak, Elian's movements became even more intense. He was practically standing up, driving the sound out of the instrument. The room vibrated. The glass in the exit signs rattled. The music was roaring now, a tidal wave of sound that washed over the crowd, cleaning away their judgments and their doubts. There was no pity left in that room. There was only awe. Then, suddenly, Elian's hands lifted high. Into the air. The music stopped instantly. The silence that rushed back in was different than before. It wasn't an empty, waiting silence. It was a heavy, ringing silence that was full of the energy he had just unleashed. The final chord seemed to hang in the air like smoke, refusing to fade away. Elian sat there, his chest heaving up and down, his hands hovering over the keys. He slowly opened his eyes. He looked down at the piano as if surprised to see it there. For a moment he looked fragile again, like a bird that had just flown through a storm and landed. The piano had spoken. It had screamed and cried and sung, and now it was finally quiet. For 3 long seconds, the auditorium remained trapped in that heavy, ringing silence. The air seemed to vibrate with the ghost of the music that had just filled the room. It was as if the audience had been collectively lifted up into the air and dropped, leaving them breathless and disoriented. Elian sat still on the bench, his chest rising and falling rapidly, his hands hovering over the keys. He didn't look up. He was almost afraid to see what was waiting for him in the blinding light. Then, from the very back of the hall, a single person started clapping. It was a slow, rhythmic clap. 1 pair of hands, then 2, then 5. Within moments, the sound grew. It wasn't polite applause anymore. It was a roar. It started as a wave and turned into a thunderstorm. People leaped to their feet. A man in the 5th row whistled loudly through his fingers. A woman near the front pressed her hands to her heart, tears streaming down her face, clapping so hard her palms must have stung. The noise was deafening. But this time it wasn't scary. It didn't feel like a wall. It felt like a warm ocean wrapping around him. Elian finally opened his eyes wide. He blinked against the bright stage lights, trying to see. The faces of the crowd were still mostly shadows, but he could feel them. He could feel the energy in the room. It had changed completely. The pity, the boredom, the judgment, it was all gone. In its place was shock, respect, and awe. He didn't know what to do. He wasn't a showman. He didn't have a bow prepared. He stood up abruptly, his legs feeling shaky like a newborn deer. He gave a quick, awkward nod toward the darkness of the audience. He didn't smile. He looked serious, almost overwhelmed. Then he turned and practically ran off the stage, fleeing the spotlight as if it were a fire. The moment he stepped into the wings, the cool air hit his sweaty face. Mrs. Gable was standing there, her clipboard forgotten on the floor. She looked at him with her mouth open, her eyes shining with tears. She didn't say, "Good job," or "You were cute." She just stared at him, seeing him for the first time. "Elian," she whispered, her voice shaking. She reached out and pulled him into a hug. It was a tight, squeezing hug, the kind a mother gives. Elian stood stiff for a second, his arms hanging by his sides, unused to this kind of affection. Then, slowly, he let his head rest on her shoulder. The tension of the last few weeks finally drained out of him. He wasn't just the quiet boy anymore. He was Elian the musician. "Thank you," he whispered, so softly she almost didn't hear it. It was the most he had said to her in months. Outside the heavy velvet curtains, the applause was still going on. The audience didn't want to let him go. They were cheering for an encore, shouting his name. But Elian didn't go back out. He had said what he needed to say. The piano had spoken, and now it was time to listen to the silence again. Mrs. Gable let him go and wiped her eyes. "You have to go back to the dressing room," she said, sniffing. "I'll be there in a minute. I have to go introduce the next act." She laughed a wet, happy laugh. "Though I don't know how anyone can follow that." Elian walked down the long, narrow hallway backstage. The floor was concrete and cold under his sneakers. He could hear the muffled sounds of the next act starting up on stage, someone playing a pre-recorded track. It sounded flat and lifeless compared to the living energy of the piano. He turned the corner toward the exit where the performers gathered. Suddenly, he stopped. Standing by the water fountain was the tall boy. Elian's heart skipped a beat. The old fear instinctively kicked in. His shoulders hunched, ready for the insult, ready for the laugh. He looked at the floor, trying to walk past without being seen. "Hey," Elian stopped. He looked up. The tall boy wasn't laughing. He wasn't surrounded by his friends, either. They were still inside the auditorium, probably wondering where he was. The tall boy was holding a soda, but he wasn't drinking it. He was just looking at Elian with a strange expression on his face. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The hallway was dimly lit, buzzing with the distant echo of the show. "I didn't know you could do that," the tall boy said. His voice wasn't mean. It was quiet. Almost confused, Elian didn't say anything. He just looked at him. I thought you were just messing around," the tall boy continued, shifting his weight from one foot to the other. He looked down at his expensive sneakers. That was actually really good. Like, really good. He looked back up at Elian. He didn't offer a high five. He didn't try to fake buddy up to him. But the arrogance was gone. The smirk was erased. He just nodded his head once. A real nod. A sign of respect. "Good luck out there," the tall boy said, then turned and walked away toward the stage. Elian watched him go. The knot in his stomach loosened. The bully had been defeated, but not with fists or angry words. He had been defeated by something bigger. He had been defeated by the truth. Elian felt a small spark of warmth in his chest. He walked out the back door of the community center and stepped into the cool night air. The city was still noisy. Cars honked on the street nearby. Sirens wailed in the distance. But to Elian it sounded different now. It wasn't just irritating noise. It was the rhythm of the world. He heard the syncopated beat of a car driving over a pothole. He heard the melody of the wind in the trees. It was all music. He walked the few blocks to his apartment building. He didn't walk with his head down, staring at his shoes. He walked with his head up, looking at the streetlights reflecting off the puddles on the sidewalk. He felt taller. He felt lighter. When he got home, the house was quiet. His mother was asleep in her chair, exhausted from a long week of work. Elian didn't wake her. He just walked into his small bedroom and closed the door. He sat on the edge of his bed. He looked at his hands. They looked the same as they did yesterday, calloused, a bit dirty under the fingernails. But they felt different. He knew now that these hands could do more than just hold things. They could build castles in the air. They could move mountains. They could make people cry and cheer and feel things they didn't know they had inside them. Elian lay back on his pillow, staring up at the ceiling in the dark. He knew that tomorrow things would be different at school. The kids might still whisper, but now they would whisper about the music. The teachers might actually look at him. His life had changed direction in just 5 minutes on a stage, but it didn't matter if he became famous or rich. That wasn't why he played. He played because the silence was too heavy to carry alone. He played because he had a voice, and finally, he had found a way to use it. A smile tugged at the corner of his mouth, a small, shy smile that nobody saw. He closed his eyes and listened to the beat of his own heart, steady and strong. He fell asleep to the sound of his own symphony, knowing that no matter what happened next, he would never be silent again.